In every major conflict, there emerges a certain image of what a commander should be: precise, measured, and cooperative. The typical officer of the Second World War was expected to act as a careful architect of war, maintaining harmony between political demands and military realities. Men like Eisenhower or Bradley embodied this mold. Patient organizers of vast armies, capable of managing egos as deftly as divisions. Their strength lay not in fiery brilliance, but in coordination, the ability to keep an immense and chaotic war machine running smoothly across continents. Yet beneath that orderly facade lay a deeper paradox. War is not governed solely by systems or spreadsheets. It thrives equally on boldness, instinct, and the willingness to gamble everything for a breakthrough. The battlefield rewards structure, but it also punishes hesitation. For every general who planned meticulously, another emerged who thrived in disorder. Commanders who saw opportunity where others saw only risk. This tension between method and madness, between control and chaos, defined the era's greatest struggles, and, ultimately, the people who led them. Into this world of careful planners and measured diplomacy strode General George S. Patton Jr., a man who seemed to have ridden straight out of another century. Where others were composed and restrained, he was fire and motion. A commander whose every gesture radiated energy, defiance, and conviction. He spoke with the swagger of an old cavalry officer, his words as sharp as his discipline, and carried himself like a knight reborn in an age of steel and oil. The twin revolvers on his hips, adorned with pearl grips, gleamed not as decoration but as a declaration of character, symbols of a man who refused to blend into the gray ranks of bureaucracy. Patton was, in every sense, an anachronism, a relic of a romantic age when warfare was as much about courage as calculation. Yet he was also incendiary, a spark in a world increasingly governed by machines and committees. His belief in speed, spirit, and audacity clashed violently with the cautious rhythm of modern command. To some, he was a genius. To others, a dangerous reminder of an older, more primal form of leadership. In the mechanized inferno of the Second World War, Patton stood as living proof that the past, when driven by sheer will, could still outpace the future. General George S. Patton Jr. embodied a living contradiction, a leader whose genius and volatility existed in equal measure. His approach to command defied almost every convention of modern warfare. Impulsive yet calculated, ruthless yet visionary, disciplined yet explosively unpredictable. In an era defined by procedure and diplomacy, Patton operated by instinct and momentum, often pushing beyond the limits of what was deemed acceptable by both his peers and his superiors. Yet it was precisely this audacity, this refusal to obey the invisible boundaries of military orthodoxy, that turned him into one of the most effective battlefield catalysts of the war. Again and again, his relentless drive shattered entrenched defenses and disrupted the rhythm of the Axis war machine. What others saw as recklessness, he wielded as strategy. What others condemned as excess, he transformed into speed and shock. In the unforgiving crucible of total conflict, Patton revealed a truth often ignored by institutions: that victory sometimes belongs not to the cautious administrator, but to the rule breaker whose very defiance becomes a weapon. For General George S. Patton Jr., the essence of warfare could be distilled into a single principle: audacity, always audacity. His philosophy rejected hesitation in all its forms. To him, movement was life. Speed was not simply an advantage, but a moral imperative. He saw battle as a contest of momentum, in which hesitation invited defeat and unrelenting pressure crushed the enemy's will long before the final blow. While others obsessed over logistics, coordination, and the sanctity of secure flanks, Patton dismissed such caution as the language of mediocrity. His creed was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and never stop. He shattered the traditional dogma that no army should advance without stable supply lines or protected sides. To Patton, the surest protection was the enemy's confusion, the inability to react to a force moving faster than logic allowed. His units often raced ahead until fuel ran dry, at which point he demanded they press on regardless. It was warfare as velocity incarnate, an orchestration of risk so great that only complete conviction could sustain it. In that relentless forward motion lay both his genius and his danger. A commander who believed that victory belonged not to the prepared, but to the unstoppable. To his soldiers, General George S. Patton Jr. was more than a strategist. He was a force of nature. His battlefield persona, often branded as blood and guts, was not mere theatrics, but a deliberate weapon of morale. His speeches, thunderous and raw, bristled with language that violated every convention of polite military decorum. Yet beneath the fury and bravado lay a calculated purpose: to strip fear of its power and replace it with aggression, pride, and momentum. Patton understood that men on the brink of combat did not need calm reassurance, they needed fire in their veins. His address to the Third Army before the great push through Europe remains a defining moment of this philosophy. When he told his troops they would hold the enemy by the nose and kick them where it hurts, he wasn't indulging in crudeness for its own sake. He was forging a mindset. It was psychological conditioning, a kind of verbal armor meant to make his soldiers believe they were the storm rather than its victims. In doing so, Patton broke the genteel officer and gentleman mold entirely. He transformed leadership into theater, fury into discipline, and words into weapons, proving that victory often begins not with tactics, but with belief. Among the most extraordinary aspects of General George S. Patton Jr.'s character was his unwavering conviction that he had walked the earth many times before. He spoke openly of having lived and fought in earlier ages, as a Roman soldier, a marshal under Napoleon, even a Norse warrior sailing into battle beneath storm-lit skies. To his contemporaries, such claims bordered on the fantastical. To Patton himself, they were proof of a destiny stretching across centuries. This belief in rebirth was not a quirk of imagination, but a pillar of identity. It explained his instinct for battle, his comfort amid chaos, and his sense that every campaign was merely a continuation of an eternal mission. Because he saw himself as a warrior reborn, fear held little power over him. Danger to Patton was familiar, the echo of countless past struggles replaying on new fields. His confidence, which many mistook for arrogance, was rooted in this conviction that he had been shaped by ages of conflict and was fulfilling a role written long before his birth. While others viewed war as a grim necessity, Patton felt it as homecoming, a return to the stage where his soul had always belonged. General George S. Patton Jr. embodied one of the strangest contradictions in modern military leadership: a rule breaker who ruled by fear. He did not seek to be loved by his men. He demanded their obedience, their precision, their absolute readiness. In a force that often celebrated camaraderie between officer and soldier, Patton chose instead the iron hand of discipline. He fined troops for minor infractions, such as failing to wear a tie in the dust and chaos of a combat zone, and railed against any sign of complacency or disorder. To his subordinates, these rules seemed merciless, even absurd. To Patton, they were sacred. The paradox lay in the way he shattered one set of conventions to impose another. He disregarded the Army's softer codes of leadership, the idea that respect must be earned through empathy, and replaced them with his own brand of relentless order. His logic was cold but clear. Soldiers who feared him more than the enemy would never falter. Discipline, he believed, was not about comfort or popularity. It was a shield against chaos, a substitute for luck. In his mind, an army ruled by strictness could not be broken, because its will, like his own, was forged in steel. In the summer of 1943, during the Allied invasion of Sicily, General George S. Patton Jr. confronted the kind of limitation he despised most: subordination. The official plan for Operation Husky assigned his U.S. 7th Army a secondary task: to guard the exposed flank of General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army as it advanced northward. For most commanders, such an order would have been routine, a matter of discipline and cooperation. For Patton, it was an insult to his instinct for initiative and speed. He saw no glory in standing still while another army claimed the momentum of the campaign. True to form, he quietly reinterpreted his orders. While officially securing the flank, Patton pushed his forces far beyond the boundaries of his directive, turning a defensive assignment into an offensive surge across western Sicily. Each mile gained was another act of defiance, not reckless, but calculated, aimed at proving that hesitation was the real enemy. To his critics, this was insubordination. To his admirers, it was genius in motion. Patton's defiance of conventional hierarchy during Operation Husky revealed the essence of his command philosophy: that initiative, even when it broke the rules, could achieve what obedience never would. The limits placed on General George S. Patton Jr. during the Sicilian campaign proved too small for his ambitions. Viewing his assigned supporting role as both tedious and unworthy of his army's potential, he chose to act rather than wait. What began as a nominal reconnaissance in force soon evolved into a bold, sweeping offensive across the island. Patton split his army with characteristic daring, launching a rapid flanking drive that transformed caution into momentum. His armored columns surged through the rugged terrain with breathtaking speed, often advancing so far and so fast that headquarters could barely keep up with their position on the map. The capture of Palermo was the crown jewel of this audacious maneuver, a lightning thrust that not only shattered local resistance, but also rewrote the campaign's hierarchy. Against his original orders, Patton effectively seized control of western Sicily and set his sights on Messina, the final prize. In a feat of both tactical brilliance and defiance, he reached the city before Montgomery's Eighth Army, turning a supposed supporting operation into a personal triumph. It was an act that encapsulated his essence, a commander who refused to crawl when he could charge and who measured obedience only by results. The brilliance that made General George S. Patton Jr. unstoppable on the battlefield also carried within it the seeds of his downfall. In Sicily, the same intensity that drove him to victory crossed into darker territory when he violated the most sacred principle of leadership, the duty to protect one's own. In two separate incidents, Patton struck soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, condemning them as cowards in front of their peers. To the military establishment and the public alike, it was a shocking act, not only of cruelty, but of profound misunderstanding. The man who demanded absolute discipline from his troops had, in that moment, lost control of himself. The repercussions were immediate and severe. News of the assaults reached the highest levels of command, and the same general once hailed as a symbol of Allied momentum suddenly stood on the brink of ruin. He was ordered to apologize publicly, stripped of his place in the upcoming D-Day invasion, and quietly removed from command. The architect of speed and audacity was now sidelined by his own recklessness. It was a moment of bitter irony, the ultimate rule breaker, undone not by the enemy's fire, but by his own unrestrained will. In the aftermath of D-Day, the Allied armies found themselves ensnared in a brutal and grinding struggle across the Normandy countryside. What had begun as a daring amphibious assault soon devolved into a slow-motion battle of attrition within the claustrophobic maze of the French hedgerows, the infamous bocage. Each field was a fortress, each lane a potential ambush. Tanks could barely maneuver, visibility was limited to a few yards, and progress was measured in meters, not miles. The German defenders, skilled and entrenched, turned the landscape into a natural fortress that devoured momentum and morale alike. This was not the kind of war that suited General George S. Patton Jr.'s temperament or talent. The cautious, methodical pace of the campaign stood in stark contrast to his doctrine of movement and shock. To Patton, the Normandy stalemate represented everything he despised about cautious warfare: slow, predictable, and draining. Yet within this quagmire lay the perfect proving ground for his philosophy. Once given the reins of the newly activated Third Army, he would transform the campaign from a slog into a storm, showing that audacity, when unleashed, could tear through the densest obstacles of terrain and doctrine alike. When Operation Cobra finally shattered the German defenses in late July 1944, the long-awaited opening in the Allied line appeared, a narrow gap in which most commanders would have seen opportunity tempered by caution. To General George S. Patton Jr., however, it was nothing less than liberation. With the activation of his long-prepared but secretive Third Army, he was unleashed into the breach with the freedom to do what he understood best: transform breakthrough into collapse. Traditional military doctrine dictated restraint after such a victory: advance, halt, secure the sides, and build a stable front before pressing on. Patton dismissed that notion entirely. To him, the very concept of a front line was a relic of static thinking. The enemy, once broken, should never be given the time to recover or reform. Instead of pausing, he hurled his divisions forward in all directions, turning the initial penetration into a full-scale unraveling of the German position. In doing so, Patton shattered not only the enemy's defenses, but the entire logic of conventional warfare. His strategy was movement without hesitation, chaos as a weapon, and speed as the ultimate form of security. What followed was one of the most breathtaking military drives in modern history. Once unleashed through the breach at Normandy, General George S. Patton Jr.'s Third Army did not merely advance. It erupted across France with a ferocity and speed that defied every conventional measure of warfare. In a matter of weeks, his armored columns covered hundreds of miles, moving faster than even the famed German Blitz of 1940. Villages and strongpoints that had taken months to conquer in earlier campaigns fell in hours. The enemy, stunned and disoriented, faced not an advancing army, but a relentless tide that seemed to have no front, no pause, and no limit. The details remain almost unbelievable. His lead elements literally drove beyond the boundaries of their own maps, charting new routes faster than cartographers could update them. His spearheads outpaced their own fuel convoys, halting only when their tanks ran dry. Not because of resistance, but because they had outrun their lifeline. When the German counterattack struck at Mortain, any conventional general would have halted the offensive to consolidate. Patton did the opposite. He coolly peeled off a single division to blunt the enemy's strike while the rest of his army surged eastward, refusing to surrender momentum for safety. In this campaign, the Third Army did more than reclaim territory. It obliterated the German strategic position in France. By breaking every rule of caution and redefining mobility itself, Patton transformed a local breakthrough into a national collapse, proving that speed and audacity, when fused with will, could remake the very logic of war. In December 1944, the calm of the Western Front shattered beneath the weight of one final desperate gamble by the German High Command. In a blinding snowstorm, enemy forces launched a sudden and ferocious counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had considered too difficult for major operations. The result was chaos. Entire divisions were caught off guard, supply lines crumbled, and command posts dissolved into confusion. At the center of the storm, the 101st Airborne Division found itself encircled in the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. For a moment, it seemed as though months of hard-won progress might collapse in days. The German advance carved a massive bulge into the Allied lines, a spear aimed at splitting the armies apart and perhaps reversing the entire Western campaign. Communication faltered, weather grounded air support, and morale began to waver. It was a moment of crisis unlike any since Normandy, the kind of disaster that demanded not caution or consensus, but a commander willing to act with impossible speed and clarity. That man, as fate would have it, was George S. Patton Jr. As the German onslaught tore through the Ardennes, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower convened an emergency conference with his senior generals. Around the table sat men of immense experience, Bradley, Bedell-Smith, and Patton among them, each grasping the scale of the unfolding disaster. The 101st Airborne was trapped, the front was splintering, and time was running out. Eisenhower turned to Patton with the critical question: how long would it take for his Third Army, then locked in heavy combat over 100 miles to the south, to disengage, pivot north, and strike the German flank? Patton's reply stunned the room. 48 hours, he said, without hesitation. The statement seemed absurd, even laughable to his peers. Every established rule of warfare made it impossible. No army could simply detach from an ongoing engagement, execute a 90-degree turn, and redeploy over 100 miles of frozen roads in the midst of one of Europe's worst blizzards. Even if by some miracle they arrived, coordinating a counterattack under such conditions defied both logistics and logic. Yet Patton's confidence was not bravado. It was preparation. Unknown to most in that room, he had already begun planning 3 separate contingency offensives days earlier, a testament to his instinct for anticipating chaos. What others saw as madness, Patton had already set in motion. By the time the crisis in the Ardennes reached its peak, General George S. Patton Jr. was already in motion. While others were still debating plans and possibilities, he had quietly broken the unspoken rule of consensus. Acting on instinct, what he called a hunch, he had ordered his staff 3 days earlier to prepare for the unthinkable, a complete pivot of the Third Army to the north. It was a logistical operation so vast and intricate that it bordered on the miraculous. entire armored and infantry divisions disengaged from active combat, executed a 90-degree turn, and advanced over 100 miles through ice-choked roads and relentless snow. What followed was one of the most astonishing maneuvers in modern military history. By December 26, his forces slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive and broke the encirclement at Bastogne, freeing the trapped 101st Airborne. It was not merely a tactical victory. It was a triumph of will and organization over chaos and weather. And then came the final, almost mythic detail. When storms threatened to ground air support, Patton summoned the Third Army's chaplain and ordered him to compose a prayer for clear skies. The weather soon broke. Allied aircraft took to the air, and Patton, half amused and half sincere, awarded the chaplain a medal. It was the perfect embodiment of his paradox: faith fused with audacity, discipline intertwined with defiance. A man who bent not only the rules of war, but on occasion seemed to bend the elements themselves. In the aftermath of victory, when the thunder of guns gave way to the uneasy quiet of occupation, General George S. Patton Jr. confronted the one rule even the greatest battlefield commanders were never meant to challenge: the rule of obedience to civilian authority. In the hierarchy of democratic warfare, the soldier fights, the politician governs, and the two must never overlap. But Patton, shaped by conviction rather than convention, could not accept the neat separation between strategy and policy. To him, the war had not truly ended. It had only changed form. He viewed political restraint as another battlefield limitation, one that, in his mind, endangered the fruits of everything won through blood and movement. Where others adjusted to peace, Patton remained at war, not against nations, but against indecision, compromise, and the bureaucratic caution he despised. His refusal to mute his opinions, even when they clashed with official policy, marked his final act of rebellion. It was the culmination of a career defined by defiance. The soldier who had defied doctrine, defied logistics, defied fear itself, now defied the boundaries of the very institution he served. When the war in Europe ended, General George S. Patton Jr. was appointed military governor of Bavaria, a position meant to showcase his discipline and administrative skill in rebuilding a shattered nation. Yet peace, for Patton, proved more perilous than war. Unaccustomed to silence and untrained in diplomacy, he began speaking his mind with the same blunt force he once reserved for commanding armies. In press conferences and private remarks that soon became public, he openly criticized the Allied re-education policies, arguing that Germany's reconstruction was being mishandled. His most explosive comments came when he drew reckless comparisons between former party members in Germany and mainstream political factions back home, a statement that sent shockwaves through Washington. But it was his final breach of restraint that sealed his fate. In moments of frustration, Patton suggested that the Allies had fought the wrong opponent, that the real threat now lay to the east, and that former German soldiers might have to be rearmed to confront it. In a post-war world desperate for stability, such words were heresy. They violated not just protocol, but the moral and political foundations of the Allied victory. The warrior who had once embodied America's relentless advance across Europe now stood as a symbol of dangerous candor. A man whose greatest strength, his refusal to conform, had finally become his undoing. In the end, the weight of his defiance caught up with him. For years, General George S. Patton Jr. had thrived on the edge of chaos, bending orders, challenging superiors, and rewriting the laws of warfare through sheer force of will. But in peacetime, that same defiance became untenable. His words and actions, once excused as the fiery passion of a wartime genius, now appeared as insubordination in an era that demanded restraint. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the friend who had shielded him through controversy after controversy, could no longer protect him. The decision was inevitable and painful. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army, the force that had carried his name into legend. It was a tragic symmetry. The general who had shattered enemy lines and defied every rule of combat was ultimately undone by his inability to stop breaking them when the fighting was over. His downfall was not the work of rivals or enemies, but of his own restless spirit, a man built for war, who could not find a place in peace. General George S. Patton Jr. remains one of history's most striking contradictions. a flawed masterpiece of leadership forged entirely for the chaos of battle, yet tragically out of place in the stillness of peace. His brilliance and volatility were inseparable, each feeding the other in a cycle of inspiration and destruction. He was not a man who adapted to war. He was a man born for it. When the world demanded restraint, he gave fury. When others hesitated, he charged forward, often recklessly, yet with results that reshaped the course of the conflict. Patton's defiance was not without consequence, but it was also the key to his greatness. His willingness to shatter convention, to move faster and strike harder than logic allowed, saved countless lives by ending campaigns weeks or even months sooner than expected. His armored spearheads did more than break through enemy lines. They broke the enemy's confidence, stripping away the illusion of invincibility that had defined the German war machine. In his wake, the momentum of the Allied advance became unstoppable. History remembers many kinds of generals. It remembers the careful planners like Eisenhower, the steady hands who manage victory. But before such order can exist, it requires the chaos of visionaries like Patton, the rebels who fight not by the book, but by instinct. He was, in the truest sense, old blood and guts, a man who proved that sometimes the preservation of civilization depends on those willing to defy its rules entirely, if only to rebuild them anew.